I can toggle off this natural language view by going to this little button up here with the chat bubble, hide natural language, and I can toggle that on and off as I wish. Also, the way that I am accessing this pane over here, where we see scope and filters, is via this bar table sort of icon, where I can toggle on advanced view, simple view, advanced view, simple view. The advanced view is useful for all sorts of advanced capabilities. It's well named like that. We might here start to do things that will allow us to operate upon a more hierarchical structure of data using the scope pane up here. We might use the filter pane, as we've covered, to filter out aspects of the data such that we're only operating upon payloads that match a given criteria. So let's start with that since we're already using that particular aspect, the filter here. So as I mentioned, in any rule sheet pretty much in the course of a dynamic form decision service, we're going to be expanding out this pane so that we can use the filter line item and drag in UI.current stage number, and setting it to 0 at the initial stage, and whatever the other stages involved in the form is likewise where we'll assign it to be within the filters aspect of the rule sheet. Now, for performance reasons, but also to make sure that Corticon is basically stopping at the door as soon as it sees that the particular in-memory data being evaluated has the attribute current stage number to be anything but current stage number equals 0, in which case we want to skip over this rule sheet. We want to then not just type in current stage number equals 0, but moreover right click on it and click precondition. That'll essentially make us not need to filter out potentially other aspects of the data that's not within the actual data structure of the UI entity. If I had, for example, other aspects of this rule sheet operating upon different entities, then those could still be evaluated by the rules. I'm only filtering out by default, unless I use this precondition toggle, I'll only be filtering out everything within the context of this UI entity and all of its child entities, child association entities. It won't be filtering out any instance where I have a different root entity that is not the UI entity. Suffice to say that we'll be able to solve for any case where there is other data, and it's a best practice anyways in these dynamic forms, by always assigning the current stage number filter to be a precondition, not just a basic filter. Now, there are other things that can make it a bit easier to grasp what's going on in the rule sheet syntax itself. For example, I might want to, instead of these long strings of text where I am using the syntax of UI.containers.UI controls, just to be sure that I'm applying a UI control within the context of a container, within the context of a UI, which is the necessary data structure. But because it's a bit of a long read in that way, maybe I want to create an alias for the UI controls to use that as a reference to whenever I am using the alias controls. By double-clicking here, I can define what a given child entity within the scope of this particular rule sheet is going to be referred to as. Whenever I use controls in the scope of this particular rule sheet, then Corticon will evaluate that, oh, you mean UI.containers.UI controls. So that's just the aesthetic aspect of why we might use these aliases up here. The other thing that we're going to need to consider, especially as we look at those multiple choices UI control types, is going to be another instance where we're going to need to create and make use of this scope pane. So you'll see that I don't have, for this UI control type, for state and province, I don't have any of the options filled out yet. And we'll get into where those are coming from. But before we circle back to scope and how I'm using it in that subsequent rule sheet of the multiple choices UI control type, let's just talk a little bit about the syntax here as well. So to create an entity, because I'm only going to be you'll recall that back within the actual dynamic form that I was interacting with, on the input payload, I'm never passing in anything but two different JSON objects, one containing the attributes within the UI entity, such as current stage number and language, and likewise the accrued data, which is going to be the JSON object that has the name of the path to data, or multiple path to datas if I've toggled different paths to data over the course of a form and accrued different data elements as a result. What I won't be passing in is any container, so the container and the UI controls within it is ephemeral within the context of a stage number. It won't be retained for the life of the form beyond just when we're in that particular stage number. That means that when at every subsequent stage that I want to create some sort of container containing some sort of content for the end user, if I'm on a brand new stage, then I need to create a container within the context of this root entity UI, and I need to create any number of UI controls within the context of that container. So I'm creating a UI.containers equals container.new. That is the vernacular through which I can create new entities that are associated with other entities. So what I'm doing here is not just saying I want to create a container for a container's sake. I don't want a container up here. I want it to be a child entity of UI, and I want UI controls to be a child of containers. So when I create the container, the alternative way, if I did want it to just be a root entity, I could have started with container.new, and that would be enough to just have a container irrespective of a parent entity. If I want it to be a child entity, then I will use this syntax of UI.containers equals container.new. When I want to create more than one of a given entity type as a child entity, that's when I'm using this plus equals. That will add to the what we call a collection of UI controls upon this root container. So I have any number of UI controls being associated to this container in each of these lines where I'm using controls plus equals UI control do. And then everything in the brackets when we're using this rule syntax, this is me assigning what the values will be for this newly created entity. So I'm not just creating a new UI control, but as part of the syntax to create the UI control, I'm assigning what the type of UI control is, the value of that content, the ID, or anything else that might be necessary depending on the UI control type that I'm creating. Now, one other thing to note is the fact that it's important but not mandatory that we capture the field names such as street address underneath the actual entity that path to data is being mapped to. So when I create UI.path2data, assign that to be the name of this association. As you recall, we're assigning the path to data to not be the root entity, but the actual association itself. So when I'm creating this, I don't necessarily need to have street address to be an attribute underneath property. Regardless of if I do or not, Corticon, or the front end rather, is going to store, accrue whatever the value that the user selects from the dynamic form in the same sort of JSON structure that would look like this, where it is property as the JSON object name and the particular field name of street address with the value therein. If I want to use it as part of the rules in any capacity though, I'll need to map that specific field to the street address attribute within a vocabulary. So essentially what I'm saying is that in order to use any of the data that we're prompting a user to enter, in order to use that at subsequent stages of the form versus just accrue it for accruing its sake and passing it downstream later on, then we're going to need to capture that particular attribute as an attribute underneath the entity in the rule vocabulary.